Captain Jake Morrison walked through the long metal halls of Nexus Station and felt very small. The walls around him were made of strange crystal that glowed with soft blue light. He had never seen anything like this place before. No human had ever been here. He was the first of his kind to step foot in this ancient building that floated in space between the stars. Jake wore his best uniform, but it felt plain compared to what he saw around him. Strange creatures walked past him in the halls. Some had scales that changed colors. Others looked like walking trees with too many arms. A few were just floating balls of light that whispered to each other in voices like wind chimes. Commander Lisa Hayes walked beside Jake and tried to look calm, but her hands shook just a little. She carried a thick book full of papers about human history and culture. Lisa had spent 3 years learning about alien customs just for this day. She knew that what happened here would decide if humans got to be part of the galaxy, or if they would be treated like pets. Dr. Paul Chen followed behind them with his recording devices. He was supposed to watch and learn about all the different alien species. Paul had studied aliens his whole life, but only from far away. Now he was surrounded by them, and it felt like being in a dream. The 3 humans had traveled for 6 months to reach Nexus Station. Their ship was small compared to the massive alien vessels docked outside. Some of those ships were bigger than entire cities on Earth. Jake wondered how his people could ever compete with beings who built such amazing things. They reached a huge round room with a ceiling so high Jake could not see the top. Thousands of aliens sat in rows that went up and up like a giant bowl. In the center was a small platform where a creature that looked like liquid metal was speaking in a voice that sounded like music. Lisa whispered to Jake that this was how it worked. Every species that wanted to join the galactic community had to come here and tell their best story. The aliens would listen and then decide what rank the new species would get. The better the story, the higher the rank. The higher the rank, the more freedom and power that species would have among the stars. Jake looked around at all the different aliens and wondered what stories they had told. A group of tall beings with too many eyes sat in the highest seats. They wore robes covered in gems and looked very important. Lisa told him those were the Void Hunters. They had told a story about conquering black holes and using them as weapons. Now they controlled the military forces of the galaxy. Below them sat creatures that looked like living diamonds. These were the Crystal Collective. They had shared a tale about joining every mind on their planet into one perfect thought. Now they were the judges and lawmakers for thousands of worlds. Near the top were the Zephyrians, who looked like giant birds made of wind and starlight. Their story was about taming the solar winds that blow between planets. They now controlled all trade and travel routes through space. Jake noticed that the aliens sitting in the lower rows looked different. They seemed smaller and quieter. They did not wear fancy clothes or jewelry. Some of them were cleaning the floors or carrying food to the important aliens above them. Paul pointed out a group of blue aliens with 4 arms who were fixing broken equipment. Lisa checked her notes and said those were the Harmony Singers. Their story had been about working together to save their dying planet. The council had decided this was not impressive enough, so now they worked as servants to keep the station running. Near them were tall, thin aliens with large heads who were organizing data tablets. These were the Memory Keepers. They had told a story about saving all the books and knowledge from their world before their son died. The council thought this was boring, so now they worked as living libraries for other species. Jake felt sick as he realized what was happening. The aliens who told stories about war and conquest and power got to be the rulers. The ones who told stories about helping others and saving lives got to be the servants. It was like the whole galaxy was run by bullies who only cared about who was strongest. The liquid metal alien finished speaking and flowed off the platform. A new creature took its place. This one looked like a giant spider made of glass and spoke in clicks and whistles. A device in Jake's ear translated the words. The spider thing was telling a story about how its people had learned to eat starlight instead of food. The crowd of important aliens nodded and whispered to each other. Jake could tell they were impressed. Lisa grabbed Jake's arm and pointed to a glowing sign that showed the order of speakers. Humanity was listed near the bottom. They would have to wait for dozens more species to tell their tales before it was their turn. Jake watched species after species take the platform. Each one tried to tell a story that would impress the powerful aliens at the top. They talked about destroying their enemies or building impossible machines or evolving beyond the need for physical bodies. The pattern was always the same. The more violence and power in the story, the higher the rank they would get. As the hours passed, Jake began to feel hopeless. How could humans compete with aliens who could eat stars or turn planets into weapons? Earth's greatest achievements seemed tiny compared to what he was hearing. Humans had barely learned to travel between planets while these beings were reshaping entire solar systems. But something else bothered Jake even more. He kept looking at the servant aliens in the lower rows. Despite being treated as slaves, many of them seemed happy. The harmony singers hummed quietly while they worked, and their music was beautiful. The memory keepers shared gentle smiles when they thought no one was looking. There was something special about them that the powerful aliens seemed to be missing. Jake realized that maybe the whole system was wrong. Maybe the most important stories were not about power and conquest. Maybe the real strength was in the quiet voices that had been pushed down to the bottom of this giant room. Soon it would be his turn to speak for all of humanity, and Jake had no idea what story he should tell. Jake sat in the small room they had given him to prepare for his speech and stared at the wall. The metal surface showed images of Earth that changed every few seconds. Green forests and blue oceans and white clouds drifted past, but they felt very far away now. In a few hours, he would stand before thousands of aliens and tell them about humanity. What he said would decide the fate of every person back home. Lisa paced back and forth across the room while talking to people on Earth through her communication device. Admiral Kate Sullivan's voice crackled through the speakers from millions of miles away. She was angry that Jake was taking so long to decide on a story. "Tell them about our wars," the Admiral said. "Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We've learned how to kill better than any species in the galaxy probably has. Show them we're predators they should respect and fear." Lisa stopped pacing and looked at Jake. She has a point. Every high-ranking species here told stories about conquest and dominance. The Void Hunters conquered black holes. The Crystal Collective absorbed entire populations into their hive mind. The Zephyrians tamed the solar winds themselves. Dr. Paul looked up from his notes about the alien species they had observed. "The pattern is clear," he said. "Violence and power equal respect in this society. If we want to avoid becoming servants, we need to present humanity as apex predators." Jake rubbed his temples and tried to think. He could tell the aliens about human wars, the great battles that had shaped history, the weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds, the soldiers who never gave up even when facing impossible odds. Humans were good at fighting. Maybe that was enough. But every time Jake tried to write down words about human warfare, something felt wrong. He kept thinking about the servant aliens he had seen in the council chamber, the blue harmony singers who hummed while they worked, the tall memory keepers who smiled at each other when they thought no one was watching. There was something beautiful about them that the powerful aliens seemed to have lost. Admiral Sullivan's voice came through the speaker again. "Morrison, are you listening? Time is running out. Earth needs you to secure us a decent position in this galactic hierarchy. We can't afford to be classified as a servant species." "I understand the stakes," Jake said quietly. "But what if the whole system is wrong?" The communication device went silent for a moment. Then Admiral Sullivan spoke again in a cold voice. "Wrong or right doesn't matter. This is how their society works. We have to play by their rules if we want to survive." Lisa sat down across from Jake and opened her thick book of human history. "Look, we have plenty of material to work with. The Roman Empire conquered most of Europe. Genghis Khan built an empire that stretched across continents. Napoleon almost conquered all of Europe. We've had 2 world wars where millions died. Humans know how to fight and win." Paul nodded and showed Jake his tablet full of data about successful alien presentations. Every species that achieved high rank told stories about dominating their enemies or their environment. The mathematical correlation is perfect. Peaceful species become servants. Violent species become rulers. Jake looked at the images of Earth still playing on the wall. A picture of children playing in a park came up, and he stared at it for a long time. "What if we told them about our teachers instead?" he said. Lisa and Paul exchanged worried looks. "Teachers don't conquer galaxies," Lisa said gently. "No," Jake replied. "But they shape the minds that do." The communication device beeped and Admiral Sullivan's voice returned. "Morrison, I just received word that 3 more human colonies have gone dark. We think alien scouts are testing our defenses. We need allies out here and we need them now. Whatever story you tell better get us respect." Jake closed his eyes and tried to imagine standing before all those alien species. He could see himself telling them about human warriors and weapons and conquests. He could describe the great battles and the empires that rose and fell. The powerful aliens would nod in approval and give humanity a middle rank somewhere in their hierarchy, but he could also imagine the servant aliens listening from the bottom rows. The ones whose stories of cooperation and knowledge and harmony had been judged as weakness. They would hear his tale of human violence and know that another species had chosen power over compassion. "There's something else bothering me," Jake said. "I've been watching the servant species during the presentations. They're not broken or defeated. The harmony singers keep the entire station running even though they're treated like slaves. The memory keepers have preserved knowledge from civilizations that died millions of years ago. They're doing incredible things, but nobody notices because everyone is focused on the flashy displays of power from the top ranks." Paul frowned at his data. "That's an interesting observation, but it doesn't change the facts. This society rewards strength and punishes weakness. If we want to protect Earth, we need to appear strong." Lisa's communication device beeped with an incoming message. She read it quickly and her face went pale. "Jake, we just received intelligence reports about what happens to servant species. Some of them have their homeworld strip-mined for resources. Others have their populations relocated to work camps. The Galactic Council doesn't just give them low ranks. They exploit them." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. If he chose the wrong story, billions of humans could end up as slaves or worse. But if he chose the obvious story about human violence, he would be betraying everything he believed made humanity special. Hours passed while Jake wrestled with the decision. Lisa continued receiving updates from Earth about alien activity near human colonies. Paul kept showing him data about successful presentations by warrior species. Admiral Sullivan called every hour to demand an update on his progress. Finally, Jake stood up and walked to the wall screen showing images of Earth. A picture appeared of an old man in a simple sweater talking to children. Jake didn't know who the man was, but something about his kind face reminded Jake of his own grandfather, who had taught him to be gentle with creatures smaller than himself. "I've made my decision," Jake said. "I'm not going to tell them about our wars." Lisa jumped up from her chair. "Jake, you can't be serious. You'll doom our entire species." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But I'd rather be enslaved for who we really are than respected for pretending to be something we're not." Paul saved his data and closed his tablet. "What story will you tell then?" Jake smiled for the first time in days. "I'm going to tell them about the humans who spend their lives helping others. The ones who run into burning buildings to save strangers. The ones who dedicate their lives to teaching children. The ones who invent medicines and give them away for free." The room went quiet except for the hum of the space station's engines. Lisa and Paul stared at Jake like he had lost his mind. Admiral Sullivan's voice came through the communicator one more time. "Morrison, you have 2 hours before you present. What's your final decision?" Jake picked up the device and spoke clearly. "I'm going to tell them who we really are." Jake walked toward the speaking platform in the center of the giant chamber and felt 10,000 alien eyes watching his every step. His heart beat so fast he worried the aliens might be able to hear it. Behind him, Lisa and Paul sat in the small section reserved for humanity. Their faces showed the same fear Jake felt inside, but he could not turn back now. The chamber fell completely silent as Jake reached the glowing circle in the center of the floor. Above him, the most powerful species in the galaxy waited to hear humanity's tale of conquest and dominance. Warprime Thesic of the hegemony of scales leaned forward in his high seat. His reptilian eyes gleamed with interest as he prepared to judge these new creatures who called themselves humans. The Crystal Collective's representative pulsed with soft light as it focused its collective consciousness on Jake's small figure. The Void Hunters shifted in their seats like predators watching prey. Every alien in the chamber expected to hear the same type of story they had heard thousands of times before. A tale of violence and power that would let them slot humanity into the proper place in their hierarchy. Jake looked up at all the powerful aliens and then down at the servant species in the lower rows. The Blue Harmony singers had stopped their cleaning work to listen. The tall memory keepers held their data tablets still and watched him with large, gentle eyes. Something in their expressions gave Jake courage. He began to speak in a quiet voice that the chamber's amplification system carried to every corner of the huge room. "I want to tell you about a man named Fred Rogers," Jake said. The aliens stirred restlessly. This was not how presentation stories usually began. Where was the tale of humanity's greatest military victory, or their most advanced weapon? War Prime Thesek's eyes narrowed as he waited for the human to get to the real story. Fred was not a warrior or a king or a scientist, Jake continued. He was a teacher who worked with small human children. Every day for many years he would put on a simple sweater and teach children how to be kind to each other. Confused whispers began to spread through the upper rows of the chamber. The Crystal Collective's light pulsed faster as it tried to understand where this narrative was going. The Void Hunters exchanged glances that seemed to ask if this was some kind of joke. But Jake kept talking. He told them how Fred Rogers would look directly at children through a viewing screen and tell each one that they were special exactly as they were. He described how this one human spent his whole life teaching young humans that their feelings mattered and that they should be gentle with others. Fred never built weapons or conquered enemies, Jake said, but he shaped the minds of millions of human children and taught them that love was stronger than fear. The chamber erupted in angry buzzing and clicking from the upper ranks. This was not a proper presentation story. Where was the tale of dominance that would demonstrate humanity's worthiness to join the Galactic Order? Several aliens began shouting demands that Jake tell a real story about human achievements, but Jake ignored the protests and continued speaking. He told them about human teachers who spent their own money to buy supplies for poor children, about doctors who traveled to dangerous places to heal the sick, about firefighters who ran into burning buildings to save people they had never met. War Prime Thesek stood up from his high seat and pointed a clawed finger at Jake. "This is not strength," he hissed. "This is weakness. You speak of servants and helpers as if they matter. Tell us of your conquests or be classified as slaves." Jake looked directly at the angry reptilian and smiled. "I am telling you about our conquests," he said. "We conquered fear with courage. We conquered hatred with love. We conquered ignorance with knowledge shared freely." The powerful aliens began to roar their displeasure, but something else was happening in the lower rows. The harmony singers had begun to hum very softly. Their musical voices blended together in a sound that had not been heard in the chamber for hundreds of years. Other servant species began to sit up straighter and listen more carefully to Jake's words. Jake continued his story and spoke about humans who dedicated their lives to protecting wild animals, about people who invented medicines and gave them away to save lives instead of making money, about strangers who helped each other during disasters without expecting anything in return. "Our greatest hero was not a general or an emperor," Jake said. "She was a woman named Harriet Tubman who risked her life over and over again to lead enslaved people to freedom. She could have stayed safe, but she chose to help others instead." The memory keepers in the lower rows began to lean forward with interest. They understood the value of preserving stories about people who chose to help rather than harm. Their large eyes reflected a recognition that Jake's tale contained a different kind of power than what the chamber usually heard. Jake spoke about human scientists who shared their discoveries freely instead of hoarding knowledge, about artists who created beauty to heal hearts broken by sadness, about ordinary people who spent their lives making the world a little better for everyone. The Crystal Collective's representative suddenly went completely dark as it struggled to process this unprecedented narrative. The Void Hunters began making threatening gestures with their weapons, but Jake did not stop speaking. "You judge strength by the ability to destroy," Jake said to the assembled aliens. "But we learned that true strength comes from the ability to create and protect and heal." More servant species began to respond to Jake's words. The tending folk who maintained the station's gardens stopped their work and listened with expressions of wonder. The star whisperers who carried messages for their masters began to whisper excitedly to each other. War Prime. Thesek's voice boomed across the chamber. "Enough of this madness. These humans speak of weakness as if it were virtue. They will be classified as the lowest servant class immediately." But as he spoke, something unprecedented began to happen. The harmony singer's humming grew louder and more beautiful. Other servant species began to make their own sounds of approval. For the first time in thousands of years, the lower rows of the chamber were not silent. Jake raised his voice above the growing chaos. "Our story is not about conquering others," he said. "It is about helping others conquer their own limitations. It is about seeing the worth in every living being and choosing to lift them up instead of tear them down." The servant aliens began to stand up one by one. Their movement sent shockwaves through the powerful species above, who had never seen such behavior from their slaves. The rigid order that had controlled The galaxy for millennia began to crack as the forgotten voices started to remember their own worth. Jake looked around at all the aliens, both high and low, and spoke his final words. We measure our success not by how many we defeat, but by how many we help to succeed. The chamber exploded into complete chaos as 10,000 years of established order began to crumble. The servant species were no longer silent, and the powerful aliens no longer knew how to maintain control. Jake had not just told humanity's story. He had reminded every being in the chamber that every story had value. Something fundamental had changed in the galaxy, and there would be no going back. The chaos in the great chamber grew louder and more dangerous with each passing moment. War Prime Thesek roared commands at his soldiers, but the Harmony Singer's beautiful humming made it hard to hear his orders. The Crystal Collective flickered between light and darkness as its hive mind struggled to process what was happening. The Void Hunters reached for their weapons while demanding that order be restored immediately. Jake stood alone on the speaking platform while thousands of angry aliens shouted around him. He had expected his story to cause some confusion, but he had not prepared for this level of chaos. Lisa and Paul tried to push through the crowd to reach him, but too many aliens were moving in too many directions. The servant species, throughout the lower rows, continued to stand and make sounds that had been forbidden for thousands of years. The Blue Harmony Singers sang melodies that told of their own forgotten dreams. The tall memory keepers began to share stories they had kept hidden in their minds. The gentle tending folk spoke about the joy they found in making things grow. For the first time since Jake had arrived at Nexus Station, the servant aliens were not invisible. Their voices filled the chamber with music and words and sounds that the powerful species had never bothered to listen to before. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. War Prime Thesek finally managed to make his voice heard above the noise. "Silence," he screamed. "The human will be classified as a servant species of the lowest order. His people will be relocated to mining worlds where they can serve their betters." But his words only made the servant species sing louder. The Harmony Singer's music swelled to fill every corner of the chamber. Other aliens began to join their voices to the song. Species that had been enemies for centuries found themselves humming the same melody. Jake watched in amazement as something impossible began to happen. The rigid boundaries that separated different species and ranks started to blur. Aliens who had never spoken to each other began to share stories and songs. The artificial divisions that had controlled the galaxy for millennia were melting away. The Crystal Collective's representative suddenly blazed with brilliant light and spoke in a voice that sounded like crystal bells. "We have calculated an error in our fundamental understanding," it announced. "We have been measuring strength incorrectly." This statement sent shockwaves through the upper ranks. The Crystal Collective had never been wrong about anything. Their perfect logic had been the foundation of galactic law for thousands of years. If they were admitting to an error, then everything was about to change. War Prime Thesek turned his anger toward the crystalline beings. "You cannot change the natural order," he snarled. "The strong rule and the weak serve. This has always been the way." But more of the powerful species began to question what they were seeing. The Zephyrians who controlled the trade routes started to whisper among themselves about the servant species, who actually maintained their ships and stations. Without the Harmony Singers' constant work, their entire transportation network would collapse within days. Jake realized that his simple story had revealed a truth that everyone had been ignoring. The so-called servant species were not weak at all. They were the ones who kept the galaxy running. They maintained the life support systems and grew the food, and preserved the knowledge that made civilization possible. The powerful species had been taking credit for work they had never actually done. Lisa finally managed to reach the speaking platform and grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to get out of here," she said. "Some of the warrior species are talking about destroying Earth as an example to prevent other species from getting similar ideas." But Jake could not leave now. He could see that something amazing was happening in the chamber. Species that had been silent for thousands of years were finding their voices. Aliens who had been treated as slaves were remembering their own worth. The entire galactic order was transforming before his eyes. Paul pushed through the crowd carrying his recording devices. "Jake, you need to see this," he said excitedly. "I'm getting reports from all over the galaxy. The servant species on every world are starting to speak up. It's like your story triggered something that was waiting to happen. On the great display screens around the chamber, Images began to appear from distant worlds. Harmony singers on mining planets had stopped their work and were teaching other species their songs. Memory keepers in the great libraries were sharing forbidden stories about their own civilizations. Tending folk were showing other aliens how to grow food in ways that healed the soil instead of depleting it. War Prime Thesic saw the same images and realized that his empire was beginning to crumble. Across hundreds of worlds, the aliens he had conquered were remembering that they had their own strength and their own stories worth telling. His roar of rage echoed through the chamber as he ordered his forces to begin military action against the rebellious servant species. But something unexpected happened when his soldiers tried to follow his orders. Many of the warrior aliens had been listening to Jake's story too. They began to question whether conquest and domination were really the highest forms of strength. Some of them put down their weapons and refused to fight against beings who were only asking to be heard. The Void Hunters tried to maintain order by threatening to destroy any world that did not return to proper obedience, but their threats sounded hollow when spoken over the beautiful music of the harmony singers. Their weapons seemed small compared to the power of millions of voices finally speaking truth. Jake looked around at the chaos he had unleashed and felt both proud and terrified. He had wanted to tell humanity's story honestly, but he had not expected it to cause a galactic revolution. Entire civilizations were changing their understanding of strength and weakness. The balance of power that had existed for thousands of years was shifting in ways no one could predict. The Crystal Collective began to pulse with new patterns of light as it recalculated everything it thought it knew about civilization and progress. "We must revise our entire database," it announced. "The variables we have been using to measure species' worth are fundamentally flawed." More of the powerful species began to realize that their positions at the top of the hierarchy depended entirely on the cooperation of the beings they had been oppressing. Without the servant species to maintain their technology and grow their food and preserve their knowledge, the great civilizations would collapse within months. The chamber continued to fill with music and stories and voices that had been silent for too long. Jake stood at the center of it all and knew that he had not just told humanity's story. He had given every species permission to tell their own story in their own voice. The galaxy would never be the same again, and that was exactly what it needed. 1 year after Jake Morrison told his story, the great chamber at Nexus Station looked completely different. The high seats where the powerful species once sat were gone. In their place was a wide circle where aliens of every kind gathered as equals. The rigid rows that had separated rulers from servants had been replaced with flowing curves that let everyone see and hear each other. Jake walked into the transformed chamber and smiled at what humanity's simple story had accomplished. Where there had once been silence from the lower classes, there was now constant conversation. Where there had once been fear, there was now curiosity. The galaxy had learned to listen to voices it had ignored for thousands of years. Lisa worked at a new station near the center of the chamber. Her job title had changed from cultural attaché to story archaeologist. She spent her days helping species recover tales that had been forbidden or forgotten during the old regime. Every week she uncovered narratives that showed the true strength and wisdom of beings who had been treated as servants. The memory keepers just shared another collection of stories. Lisa told Jake as he approached her workstation, "These are about the early days of their civilization, when they developed techniques for preserving knowledge that could survive the death of stars. The old council dismissed their presentation as boring, but their methods could help us save information for millions of years." Paul had become the galaxy's first interspecies cultural ambassador. His job was to help different aliens understand each other's stories and find common ground between very different ways of thinking. He worked with translation devices that could convert not just words but emotions and concepts between species that had evolved on completely different worlds. The tending folk are teaching the Zephyrians about sustainable agriculture, Paul reported excitedly. It turns out the wind beings never learned how to grow food without damaging their environment. The plant tenders are showing them how to work with natural systems instead of against them. Jake looked around the chamber and saw conversations happening between species that had never spoken as equals before. The Blue Harmony singers were working with the Crystal Collective to create new forms of music that could be experienced by both biological and digital minds. Former warrior races were learning from peaceful species about conflict resolution methods that did not require violence. The transformation had not been easy or complete. Some of the old powerful species had retreated to distant regions of the galaxy, where they tried to maintain their hierarchical systems. War Prime Thesek and his hegemony of scales controlled a small empire on the outer rim, where they continued to believe that might made right. But fewer and fewer worlds chose to stay under their rule, as word spread about the changes happening in the rest of the galaxy. Other former rulers had adapted to the new reality with surprising grace. The Zephyrians discovered that their mastery of solar winds made them excellent partners for species who needed help with space travel. Instead of controlling trade routes, they became guides who helped other civilizations explore new regions of space safely. The Crystal Collective had undergone the most dramatic change of all. When they recalculated their understanding of civilization using new variables like cooperation and empathy, their entire worldview shifted. They became passionate advocates for preserving the unique perspectives of every species, instead of trying to absorb everyone into their collective consciousness. Jake's role in the new galactic community was something that had never existed before. He was called a story facilitator, and his job was to help beings understand that every narrative had value. When conflicts arose between species, Jake would help them share their stories with each other until they found common ground. "We have a new situation developing in the Andromeda sector," Lisa informed Jake. "A species called the Void Shapers has been discovered. They're asking to join the galactic community, but they seem afraid to tell their story." Jake studied the report on Lisa's screen. The Void Shapers appeared to be beings made of dark matter who could manipulate space and time in small ways. Their technology was incredibly advanced, but they had been hiding from other species for thousands of years. "What are they afraid of?" Jake asked. Paul joined the conversation with additional data. "From what we can tell, their story involves running away from a great war instead of fighting. In the old system that would have marked them as cowards and made them servants. They're not sure if the changes are real or just temporary." Jake nodded with understanding. Many species were still learning to trust that the galaxy had really changed. For thousands of years, weakness had been punished and strength had been rewarded through violence. It would take time for everyone to believe that gentleness and compassion were now seen as virtues instead of flaws. "I'll go meet with them personally," Jake decided. Sometimes species need to hear directly from another being that their story matters. As Jake prepared for his journey to the Andromeda sector, he reflected on how much had changed since that day he first stood on the speaking platform. The servant species had become teachers and partners instead of slaves. The powerful species had learned that true strength came from lifting others up instead of holding them down. But the most important change was not in how species related to each other. It was in how they saw themselves. The harmony singers no longer believed their music was worthless. The memory keepers knew their knowledge was precious. The tending folk understood that their ability to nurture life was a sacred gift. Humanity had found its place in the galaxy not as conquerors or servants, but as the species that reminded everyone else of their own worth. Human colonies throughout space had become gathering places where aliens from different worlds came to share their stories and learn from each other. Jake walked toward the docking bay where his ship waited for the journey to meet the Void Shapers. The halls of Nexus Station buzzed with the sounds of a dozen different languages as species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. He passed a group of young aliens from various species who were learning together in one of the new integrated schools. Human children played alongside harmony singer offspring and memory keeper younglings. They were growing up in a galaxy where diversity was celebrated instead of feared. As Jake's ship lifted off from Nexus Station, he looked back at the space station that had become a symbol of galactic transformation. The building itself had been redesigned by cooperative effort between dozens of species. It was more beautiful and functional than it had ever been when built by conquest and slavery. The galaxy stretched out before Jake's ship, full of millions of worlds where beings were learning to tell their stories without fear. Some tales would be about great adventures and others would be about quiet acts of kindness. All of them would be heard and valued. Jake smiled as he set course for the Andromeda sector where another species waited to discover that their story mattered. The galaxy had learned that every voice had something important to say. The only question now was who would speak next and what amazing tale they would share with the stars. In space, everyone could finally hear every song that had ever been waiting to be sung.